So in preparation for today's video, I did wonder whether the use of the word overkill for this device seemed a little, well, overkill. So I thought, you know what? Oxford English Dictionary, let's look it up. So I cracked on with there, and they describe it as a noun. It's one definition is excessive use, treatment or action, or the amount by which destruction or the capacity for destruction exceeds what is necessary. I think that perfectly describes this absolute overkill of a PS5 heatsink. So there it is. I've been talking about it on the channel now for about a week or so since this thing arrived on my doorstep. This is from the company INEO or INEO, but let's be realistic about this. This is not the only example of this. Shout out to some of the YouTube watchers out there that have highlighted it. There are several different brands marketing this product at the moment. This is very much one of those solutions that's come out from the East, that's been rebranded and relabeled by a bunch of manufacturers all at the same time. So the price is kind of flexible all over the place. I've seen it for as low as 25 quid, but I've also seen it going as high as 40 or even 50 quid. This is one of those devices that at launch, there's going to be a lot of muddling around for the price tag on it. And for those that aren't aware, this is a heatsink with a difference. It takes advantage of a heat pipe. It's known as a heat pipe cooler, and unlike a lot of the SSD heatsinks that we've talked about for the PS5 thus far, this one really takes things to a whole impressive and, dare I say it, more aggressive level. Now, when it comes to utilising an SSD in your PS5 system, if you are looking at upgrading, in case you're not aware, and if you are well aware, fast forward a couple of minutes, these devices, M2 NVMEs that live inside this system, the PS5 and the M2 upgrade slot there, they can get quite hot. The PlayStation 5 has a slot dedicated to installing these inside, but the PS5 system does not include a heatsink with it for this SSD. So you're recommended when you get hold of your PS5 and M2 SSD for upgrading that you get a heatsink for this device. A heatsink is a small piece, generally of aluminium, but there are other materials out there that draws the heat away from the SSD. It doesn't stop the SSD getting hot in the first place. The idea is that those chips on the board, as electricity is passing through it, the heatsink lives on the top and it draws the heat. It allows dissipation of that heat away from the important components. And the most important of all being that one in the middle there. In the case of this SSD, this is the Team Group T-Force Cardia, and this SSD, that controller needs to be kept as cool as possible. You need the heat to be taken away from that into the heatsink. Now, all of that isn't new. The heat sinks, not only for PCs, have been around for a very long time, with one fine example there being a big chunky one from Sytem there. This is a PC-based premium prosumer heatsink. The SSD goes inside there and it draws it, all the heat away, and then dissipates it into the air. But the PS5 has a very unique build structure. It takes advantage of something called negative pressure internally, where the vents there on the front and on the rear are drawing air in via a circular, vacuum style fan internally, drawing air in and then pushing air out. It needs to have that nice contained environment. So when you have a heatsink inside this, you don't actually have a lot of room to play with on the M2 slot included. Now, recently, the solutions for this have kind of fallen into three camps. Camp 1 is to go for generic heatsinks, again like these or much, much smaller than these, like the M13 that we talked about. And these heatsinks fit inside the M2 slot inside, and they dissipate the heat away from the SSD. And even though they're in that contained block, they seem to work very, very well. We've done heat testing on those. And although they don't dissipate heat anywhere near as well as some of the other options I'm about to mention, currently they cut it quite well, which people are wondering though how long that'll affect, if there's any possible degradation to activity on the SSD. Again, we are still talking more write than read, let's bear that in mind. But still, nonetheless, a lot of you are wondering about whether they do the job, given that they're designed for PCs with a more open air chassis moving around and not the more contained slot inside there. So the second camp of people are people that buy SSDs with heat sinks included. Two classic examples here, two of the best heat sinks on the market right now. This is the Seagate FireCuda 530. This is an SSD inside there, super fast SSD that has a full surround heatsink there contained inside with all the thermal padding and more. On top of that, you've got the WD Black. The WD Black there, again, another great little heatsink, part ventilated, all the way through, and a metal surround heatsink, and this allowed dissipation of heat away from that SSD all the time, and they fit within that PS5 slot there. And again, because they're from the same manufacturer as the SSD, they can be tailored and designed with the thermal pads in the right place and the heat dissipation off of the SSD in exactly the right areas, because not all SSDs are built equal. In many cases, the controller, that chip in the middle, will be located at the top or at the bottom, or the NAND will be on either side, and more. So it's important that if you get a first-party heatsink, one of the most appealing factors of that, other than it being installed in a dust-free environment, is that the SSD inside there is being applied within the heatsink environment in the most efficient way possible. Which brings us now to where we're up to, which is heatsinks designed for this system. It's been enough time that manufacturers have designed heatsinks that go inside here. Now, one that I've talked a big game over and really liked was the Sytem designed PS5 heatsink. It fits inside the slot inside there, it fully occupies that bay, and you don't use the metal plate that covers the top. It simply fills the cavity and still covers it over, while still capturing some of the airflow inside that PS5. Again, we did some tests, great little heatsink, we will be comparing against it later. But this one, and I know this has been a long intro and I apologise, is a different kettle of fish. Because this one not only encases the M2 SSD in its own hugely designed and vented heatsink there, in that aluminium design there, with the heatsink living right the way inside there, so the SSD inside with thermal pads on either side, but it also screws in to the screw hole, and I am going to do an installation in a moment. It screws into the screw hole normally resigned for the cover on the M2 heatsink, and then we have this copper pipe here that's drawing heat away from the heatsink and then dissipating it into the air with that fanned area there. You can't quite make it out, but it is completely ventilated there at the top. Now, if we open this up in a moment, you'll see that that copper pipe runs all the way directly over the SSD inside. So again, I'm going to do a full installation in just a moment, just to let you know what you get for your money there. We've got the box there, that's where it sits there at the top. If we remove, giant bit of foam, inside we have the first time installation guide there, and again, simple bit of paper, but this is not rocket science to install. I will walk you through it in just a moment. Information on the brand, little bit of bits and bobs there on your guarantee and your warranty and stuff like that. And again, there's a 1-year warranty, I believe, on this, which is all right. It should be lifetime though. On top of that, it arrives with additional screws that can be utilised in the PS5. This is a tiny little thing, the extra heatsink and mount screws, but it's the fact that they include it. No one else includes the additional screws for their PS5 there, and I know a number of you have already noticed that the threads, those screws inside these, are actually quite soft, and if you do use quite harsh or inappropriate screwdrivers, they tear really easily. You've also got a screwdriver there, which we're going to use in a moment, and we have a whole selection of thermal pads. Now, bear in mind, really, you're only going to need 2 of them for the installation here, but it's nice they've included 4, because again, you might do a reapplication or make a mistake. So it's good that they've included extra thermal pads, but again, that's a very minor detail there. So those are our extras. I'll chuck all of those in there, the ones that we're not going to need. We're going to need those thermal pads. And what we're going to do now is install this heatsink inside this PS5 and show you exactly how it's done. So let's move that out of the way. There is my PS5. Again, I've removed this cover like a billion times now. So again, we crack that off from the top. There we go there. And as you can see inside, that's got the regular cover there at the bottom. That is the one your PS5 arrives with. So again, what we do is we take our screwdriver. Oh, there's my lucky screwdriver there. Remove it. Again, lefty loosey, righty tighty. Remove that first screw. And again, once again, there is our official PlayStation screw there. But again, you get the spare extra screw with this casing. Remove the panel. So again, there is our pretty basic metal panel there. And there is the inside of our PS5. Next up, let's remove the M2 SSD screw, because we're going to need that in just a moment. But it's worth remembering that at this point, we can stop utilising the PS5. We pop that there. because now we need to put the SSD inside this. The SSD is going to live inside this casing before we install it in there. So take the screwdriver that it hands us. Again, that noise you can hear of movement, that's just the bracket there. Something I'm not really in love with, the fact that that's not affixed, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. And what we're going to do is remove the screws from either side of this. Again, lefty loosey, righty tighty. We have 4 screws there. And it's a magnetic screwdriver as well, which is quite pleasing to see. And what we're going to do is remove all 4 of those and get this installed inside our PS5. I may have had quite a lot of coffee this morning. So again, already I've got no doubt that this is going to work. Notwithstanding their big bold claims that this is 50% less in cooling, but it doesn't really give much information on that statistic. I already can see that this is going to dissipate heat. My main query is going to be how much it obstructs the rest of the assembly inside this system. Because once you remove that base plate, you can see that thermal pipe all the way running through. So that is where our SSD is going to live. And they've gone diagonally on purpose because of the placement of the controller being different on different M2s. And that is what is going to draw heat away, not just from the heatsink, but also from the SSD itself, and dissipate it, kind of like an antenna there at the top. So the next thing we want to do is apply our first thermal pad. So again, we remove the first bit of plastic there, and we stick that on here. So again, first bit of plastic off, apply it the adhesive side evenly on there. So pop it there. Try not to do it wrong on camera. So again, push it down, as you can see. Then make sure to remove the next layer of plastic there. Don't leave these bits of plastic on. So again, there is our first part applied there. The next bit, get the base panel that it arrives with there. Again, metal. And once again, repeat what we just did. Get your thermal pad. Remove the thermal pad's first layer of plastic. Apply into the slot, face down. Make sure that the little dip there where our screwdriver goes in is not covered. Make sure that is not covered there at all. Then remove the next layer of plastic there. So again, now we've got a nice sticky adhesive panel. Then take our SSD. Once again, we're using the Cardia here. We're utilizing this because it's a single layer SSD there. Bear in mind, I've mentioned this in other videos. If it is double-sided, it doesn't matter because the way this is designed, NAND is allowed to get warm. It's the controller that is our main concern here. Now, when doing this, make sure you've got your M2 slot going at the top end. Make sure it's chip side up and then apply it so the dip, the screw hole there, dip there on the SSD is in perfect alignment with the same dip on there on the base. So you want to make sure that they both line up, the SSD dip and that of the casing. Press it in there, you'll know it's fine because it won't drop out. Then get your plate thing here, and once again you can see on the rear there another dip there at the bottom for our screw. So that's how you guide this in, and then just align it with the screw holes on the side and pop it on. And there you go, it's inside. Now we're going to attach all 4 of those screws, but that's really it for installing the SSD inside this heatsink. Again, I'm going to keep using that word overkill because it does seem to me like I'm not sure the PS5 is ever going to push an SSD hard enough to generate this kind of heat. Maybe you've got your console in like real tight environments and it's going to get hot there. Maybe you're a pro sports gamer and you clock up 8 to 10 to 12 hours of gaming a day. And in that scenario, the ambient heat of the PS5 is going to be something that's also going to degrade the performance of the SSD. And even then, these are hypotheticals. This is quite a high-end heat dissipation and cooling solution for a console. Yes, it's a closed system and it needs unique solutions, not just relying on PC components, but still, seems tremendously over the top. So the next thing we need to do is install this inside. Now, what you're going to want to do, let's remove that there and remove the screwdriver out of the way. So we want to angle this thing in. Make sure you've pulled that tiny little latch screw hole thing up, and then install it inside the slot. You'll feel it click, and then press it down. And as you can see there, everything's in alignment. So that is the installation right there. Next thing you're going to want to do is, now that SSD has been installed, you want to get that primary screw there for the M2 back inside that slot. If you've done everything that I've directed you to do so far, the screw will match immediately in with the screw hole on the console, and then just go ahead and screw it in, lefty loosey, righty tighty, and get it inside. So now that SSD is installed inside that slot with the copper heatsink. The next thing you want to do is maneuver that little latch to live over the hole which that thermal panel there was already on. Take the long screw that it arrives with, that PlayStation screw. Alternatively, use one of the 2 screws that it arrived with and install it directly in there, and you'll feel it click into the hole, and then simply screw that down into that slot. Again, there are additional screws if you've lost yours, and there you go. That is it installed. Now, the first thing worth bearing in mind, of course, this panel, that ain't going on there. There is no way that's fitting on there. It doesn't go in at all. So this is going to be a highly exposed environment there, but bear in mind that, remember, air is being drawn in this way via the front, and then that's going to be drawn over this, and again over the heatsink and the thermal pipe, I should say, as well, and then it's going to be drawn out the back on those rear vents there. So again, I've got no doubts whatsoever that this is, you know, no doubts that this is going to cool the SSD down. I think this is probably going to be the lowest temperature SSD I've ever tested here on the channel. What I'm concerned with is this thing living in front of that fan. Yes, it's, you know, going to get lots of lovely air, which is fantastic. But this air coming in through here isn't just for the SSD. The CPU, GPU, memory, everything about this system needs to be kept cool and efficient. And I'm just slightly worried about that being directly in front of that vent. It's useful, and it is ventilated, of course, so air can pass through it. But when we run our temperature test in just a moment, don't worry, we're getting there. Not only am I going to be looking at the temperature of this M2 SSD inside there with a thermal node on the controller, and I'm going to be running a second node in the ambient environment down here. There's no point in me putting a sensor here at the top. It's too close to the area of ventilation. It'll just get cooled off. We'll get an irregular reading. We want to know what the temperature is at this point, when the air has had a chance to pass through the system. We want to know that the temperature can still be good at this point, because if it's not good at this point, it's going to be bad at this point. So for now, let's go ahead and get this thing set up with the old temperature sensor from our other videos, and I'll talk you guys through the test method I'm going to go for, and then finally run through the results. Okay, so we've set the device up with the temperature sensors. So before we go through the results of when we were bench testing this on a few games there, let's have a little closer look about the setup here. Now, the first thing I want you to note is that our temperature sensor with 2 nodes is coming out of the top of the device here in the back corner. That's going to be very important, because as we bring this device down on its front and I show you how we've wired this up, you'll see that there's actually, you know, quite a busy operation going on inside here. So if we remove those cables slightly down, we can see the full layout of what we're going for here. So as you've seen already when we did that installation earlier on in the video, we've got the ice cold heatsink in there. It's already too tall to put the cover on there. It's way too big for us to put that cover. And inside that metal container, we've got our SSD fully plugged in. We've got a node, hopefully there's a photo there for you guys on screen, with the cable running into the inside of that adapter and laying on top of that controller underneath the thermal panel. So we're not testing the temperature of the heatsink, because that's no good. It's meant to be dissipating that heat. But what I'm going to be really interested to see is how much heat is dissipated by this copper heat pipe. Now, normally the heat will be dissipated, pulled away from the controller, the NAND a little bit, and the SSD in general, and then it would be soaked into this heatsink here, and then it gets dissipated into the air. But the whole point of the copper heat pipe is it kind of works as an external antenna point for all of that to run out and then be dissipated in this fanned out copper area. What makes that interesting is it is next to the PS5 fan assembly there. So remember, heat is being drawn in and out of these vents on either side, and the air is going to be massively over this dissipating heat pipe there, which hopefully means that when it's in operation, heat is being dissipated away from the SSD through the heat pipe and dispersed into the air efficiently and quickly enough that it can continue to dissipate as quickly as possible. So the main thing we want to wonder is, one, what temperature that controller is going to maintain during this operation of the couple of games and the heavy write, heavy read transfers we're going to do. Two, the ambient temperature around this device. We've got a second node down here that's going to be testing the general airflow throughout the device. It's also been really, really important that we make sure we don't restrict the airflow as much as possible. And I've tried to keep the sensors as low as possible. And as mentioned, this cabling here is being maintained via the rear, right here at the top corner of the device, where there isn't a vent point. So hopefully the cables have no, or at least a very small percentage of any kind of obstruction there, and I don't think there's any. And really the big question here is going to be, one, is it going to keep that SSD cool enough, which I think it's almost certainly going to. But two, what about the rest of the system operation? That is quite a large copper heat pipe there that's right there in front of that fan assembly point there. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the system reacts to that, having this foreign object here in the venting of that negative pressure. But for now, I'm going to get this recased up, set up our thermo and camera points, and start running our tests. Right, so the first test we conducted with the INEO heat pipe cooler for PS5 was utilising Red Dead Redemption. We compared it against that of that M13 there on screen, and as you can see, they both started at a very similar temperature, both of them starting there in the 30 to 34 C. Now the first thing we're looking at here is the controller temperature. That's the brain on that SSD, and this is the part of the SSD which you do not want to get particularly hot. The rest of the SSD, the NAND, the memory, that can get a little warm. It actually helps them improve their performance, but the controller you want lovely and cool, and because that is what's doing most of the file transmission work and the data handling. Now, the M13 there did certainly very early doors start to raise its temperature. Again, the M13 there designed for a PC system with a much larger and more open-ended airflow. The result for that was that because it's in that small confined area, there doesn't seem to be an enormous amount of ability to dissipate that heat into the surrounding area, and that's where the vents of the M13 are kind of largely designed. Whereas in the INEO heat pipe design, not only does it not have that cover on top of it because of the larger kind of ice cold aluminium surround to go around the SSD, but that copper through pipe that works as a kind of you know, heat antenna, if you will, results in not only that lower base level temperature, we're not going to focus on too much because remember we're looking at the heat difference, but also later on you can see that it only really went up a couple of degrees. Now that's because the heat being dissipated out of the SSD controller and into the heat sink is also further dissipating that temperature down that copper pipe, which is located next to the PS5's internal fan and that negative pressure vent that's drawing in that air. The result is that throughout this testing, the M13 PC heatsink in the closed contained area reached 40.8 C by the end of this gameplay session you're watching here, a rise of 5.9 C. Whereas the heat pipe and the INEO design and the surrounding aluminium casing resulted in this SSD going up to 35.2 C, an increase of just 1.4 C across the whole thing. A much smaller increase overall, but this is the performance and the temperature of the SSD. What about the surrounding ambient air? Let's perform the same test, this time monitoring the surrounding temperature in the PS5. Now the surrounding area and temperature inside the PS5 case underneath the plates but not on the SSD itself told a slightly different story. As you can see with the M13 it started at around 24.4 C. whereas the heat pipe from INEO started at 27.3 C. Now bear in mind, this second wave of testing was utilising a second temperature node, not one that's touching the SSD, and also when we finished the previous session, Red Dead Redemption was then closed back to the PSN, the system was left idle for a minute, and then the game was rebooted. The result is that in the intervening period, the ambient temperature on the Sytem test was much lower in the surrounding environment, thinking that it went down, remember, from the previous test from 40 C right the way down to 24.4 C in the surrounding environment. Whereas the heat pipe on the INEO heatsink with copper pipe there started at 27.3, and although it stayed at 27, it still kind of fluctuated at that mark, and therefore the surrounding air was certainly warmer on the INEO heat pipe than it was with the Sytem. Now a big part of that, of course, is that the Sytem, designed for PC, of course, is in that closed M2 slot with the lid on. Therefore, although it may generate a lot of the heat is contained in that little slot and that little box. How much of it ends up getting dissipated before it affects the system is hard to know. But that meant that that heat is in that small contained box. Whereas in the heat pipe, it's actually capitalizing on having an external build and therefore utilizing airflow on the PS5 to cool the heat pipe. But it did result in the tiniest fraction of an increase on ambient temperature in the PS5. Indeed, towards the end of the testing, the Sytem $10 heatsink there, the internal PS5 system reached 25.9 C, an increase of 1.5 C overall. But the heat pipe, on the other hand, only went up 0.4 C overall at 27.7. So it still maintained that temperature, which was arguably higher, although we have to bear in mind ambient room and temperature and the day of the year, but still nonetheless, it didn't dip lower because of that heat pipe, so that's worthy of note. But for now, let's try a second game and make the switch over to GTA 5 for similar tests. Heading over to Grand Theft Auto 5 here, this is still a one-player experience we're using here. We call a cab and we arrange the cab to take us to another whole part of the city. That allows us to create a controlled test environment as well as moving through the game quite a lot to introduce new assets, more AI stuff, and basically keep the system on its toes. It also means that we introduce as few kind of player controlled elements as possible that may change these variables. Now, the Sytem heatsink again started surprisingly high at 4.0 C, whereas the heat pipe on the INEO cooler here started at 34.8, a noticeable degree lower, but again, thinking of ambient airflow, thinking of the time of the year, these are only not, they're academic. We're looking at the temperature difference between them from start to end. Now, short of a few differences during gameplay where cabs or cars that we went in decided to go different routes and introduce other elements, these two tests were largely the same. And it has to be said that the increase between both of them was incredibly small, but with one key difference. The Sytem, starting at 4.0 C, 40 C, ended at 40.5 C, just half a degree increase there at 0.5. Whereas the heat pipe starting at 34.8 actually dropped in temperature. It decreased down to 34.4 C. So that had a drop of 0.4 or minus 0.4 degrees, which left a difference between them that, although is simply a degree, was actually quite intriguing, because much like the previous test, the heat pipe was clearly doing its job during the course of gameplay, dissipating heat very, very efficiently, and in this case, actually lowering the controller temperature on that SSD. We have to remember, this isn't a highfalutin PS5 game, but this is still a consistent gameplay experience that one might expect, and therefore knowing that you've got a heatsink that's dissipating heat incredibly quickly, and in some cases quicker than the system actually needs, is actually going to be quite a bit of peace of mind there. But once again, what about the ambient air? What about the surrounding environment outside of the M2 slot? Does that copper pipe still bring the temperatures higher while keeping the SSD cool? Let's repeat the tests looking at the general PS5 temperature. Once again, as soon as we started these games up after cancelling them for the previous play, then rebooting the system after a minute or so's cooldown, the M13 started at a noticeably lower temperature there at 32.7 C compared with how it ended previously at 40.5, allowing a lot of dissipation there. The heat pipe on the INEO or INEO heat pipe cooler there started at 29.3, so again around about 3 degrees difference between them. Now once again it became very clear while watching this that the dissipation of the surrounding internal PS5 system temperature was more effective on that M13 in its closed area. That heat pipe, although enormously beneficial to the SSD stored inside the PS5, was definitely kind of borrowing a lot of that airflow that originally in the design of the PS5 was likely designed for the CPU, GPU and more. The heat pipe did increase things and break into the 30s and did increase the temperature. We didn't see any minus figures this time on that heat pipe SSD heatsink. However, the M13 started to drop its temperature later on. It spiked a tiny bit at the beginning, but with the M13 $10 heatsink, it started at 32.7 in the surrounding temperature, so not on the SSD but the surrounding area, and ended at 32.4, a drop of 0.3, so minus 0.3 degrees, a third of a degree give or take. Whereas the INEO or INEO heat pipe cooler there, starting at 29.3, ended things at 30.6. So again, not an enormous increase, just shy of a degree at 0.9 in terms of increase. But I still can't overlook the fact that the contained SSD in that slot there was clearly making sure that the rest of the system temperature was kept lovely and cool, whereas the heat pipe with that extended copper pipe, although very beneficial clearly for the SSD, I am slightly concerned about how that affects the rest of the system. It's a tiny increase, and no doubt the odd degree there can be shaved off the CPU and GPU for the betterment of storage, but it's still a drop. So now we're going to make our way over to some extended read and write activity. Let's head back onto the PlayStation 5 XMB and begin the read performance test on these heatsinks and the SSD. Now this first test was to copy the games that we've played so far and a few other games of around 350 gigabytes from the SSD in underneath that heatsink and onto the PS5 SSD. So this is reading 350 gig of data so it can be moved over to the PS5 storage area. Mostly read, but obviously edits had to be made to the index on that SSD, and this does have an impact in temperature. Now the M13 PC based heatsink there, starting at 40C, went up quite quickly early doors. The heat pipe there from INEO started at 26.1 and immediately started raising quite noticeably. Now again, this really surprised me because up to this point I imagined this heatsink was going to stand up very well. But that heavy read activity certainly left its impact there overall, and it was an area in which the heat pipe for me, although still very good and still well within the boundaries of what I would deem acceptable for a PS5 SSD for gaming, was still higher than I expected it to be for this kind of activity, and certainly something I would have expected more on this drive. The M13 really stood up for itself with this heavy write activity, and something I was quite surprised by to see such a distinction between them. Overall, they both of course stayed very well within the parameters I would expect, with the heat pipe ending at 39.6 and that M13 PC heatsink ending at 46.2. A larger degree of temperature from the M13, but still you've got to factor in the different days they were recorded, and still the M13 is still holding true just being at $10, great stuff. Let's repeat the test, but sending the data back to the PS5 with some heavy write activity. Ignore what I said just there. What I meant to say was the data being written from the PS5 SSD and onto the M2 expanded SSDs in the heatsink. And as you can see there, both of them are transferring all of that data over. Now, this was much quicker, unsurprisingly, because of the way the PS5 architecture works. The heat pipe starting at 34.5 C. And the M13 PC heatsink, the $10 one there, starting at 31.1. Now, again, this is another area that left me really surprised, because the heavy write activity, of course, is where we care the most about the temperature of the SSD. The previous test, where we were writing the data back onto the PS5 SSD, we cared a lot more about the ambient temperature there in the surrounding environment. But this write activity that we're looking at here, what makes this important is 350 gigabytes, although not that much in the grand scheme of things, when most of these drives arrive with 500, a terabyte of storage, plus the infrequency with which you're going to perform an action like this. It still really surprised me how that M13 was not built for this kind of activity. As you can see there, because it's in that closed box and writing activity onto an SSD inside that slot is going to be very intensive and very hot. The M13 went from 31.1 C up to 46.5 by the end of this transfer, something you're going to see in a moment, an increase of 15.4 C overall. 46 is actually surprisingly high, getting quite close to that roof point there of 50C, where things afterwards can get a little performance intensive with throttling towards 70. Whereas the heat pipe there, starting at 34.5C, ending soon at 36.4C, was an increase of a simple 1.9. Again, incredibly small. And throughout this testing, as you're seeing it draw to a close now, it's never been a question of whether this heat pipe can dissipate heat from the SSD very well, as every test we've seen so far that shows that when the controller on that SSD is now it's concluded, you can see every time there's a test where the SSD temperature is paramount or is the concern or is the focus, this heat pipe from INEO has done the job every time. And that increase up to just 36C, when you compare it in another test coming up soon against the WD Black, which hit a stonking 50C compared to the others. Again, relative to things, still quite small, still nonetheless really surprised me with that temperature being where it was. The heat pipe does its job on behalf of the SSD, but still nonetheless, throughout all these tests, there's still the nagging thought in my head about how well it plays with the PS5's CPU, GPU and memory, and its build and the way airflow is designed. Ultimately, the M13 has done itself proud still at $10, but this heat pipe for the preservation of your SSD holds up very well. Let's conclude things. Well, what do I think? Well, let's be completely upfront. It certainly dissipated the hell out of the SSD. I've tested a lot of heatsinks over the last few months in this very system, and none of them dissipated the heat as well as this did. So, again, if you are looking for something to dissipate the heat off of that SSD and the controller to maintain performance, efficiency, durability, and more, this is the best SSD heatsink out there for that. However, there's still a few question marks for me. First and foremost, how much overkill is this? Once you look at an atypical heatsink and just how big they are, and you see just how aggressive this is, I'm not sure this system is ever going to push SSDs as hard as this thing can protect it. Now, yes, of course, of longevity, once you think, years and years and years of playback with constant use, then we're having a different conversation there, because you want the SSD that you're utilizing to maintain, you want it to last. And I think in those scenarios, when you know you're going to be clocking up 4, 5, 6 hours minimum a day, and you're maybe a professional gamer, then something like this certainly has a place. The other question, of course, is its impact on the internal system when in operation, because there is still that question mark about this existing so close to the fan assembly. It is completely see-through at the top there, those fans there, that is not a solid mass. So the air is still passing through it, and it is one solid piece, the only movable part, of course, being that clip there for the screw. But the fact it doesn't have that cover on the top, I think is going to bother some buyers. And I think although it is an impressively well-designed piece of kit, I query just how versatile it's going to be in a closed system like this. And if you are someone that likes to really think big and think protective and want to be, you know, have 3 or 4 backups at any time and be protected from absolutely any eventuality, you are the kind of buyer that's going to want this device. But everyone else, you may find this just a little bit overkill. And also, it was worth noting, and again, I don't know if you guys noticed it when I was setting it up earlier on, that the way this copper pipe lives there at the top, it's really close to where the casing plates sit and connect with this device. So you do have to be quite precise about this thing's installation, because there's a little movement there of like 1 millimeter when installing your drive inside, where once you screw it into place, this device may be just 1 millimeter higher, which gets it covering one of the holes internally where the plates go in. So as long as you install correctly, it should be absolutely fine. But still, this is a good piece of kit. I do think it does exactly what they said it will do, but it's whether you're ever going to need something as overkill as this is a decision you're going to have to make. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching. We are going to be doing, as mentioned earlier in the video, big comparisons between all of the heatsinks from Firecuda and their heatsink to the WD Black heatsink there, and of course the current favourite, the Sytem PS5 heatsink right there. We're going to be comparing all 4 of these in the dissipation of all of those different games and transferring of data to see which one does the best for the money. So, thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, then do click like. It helps me understand what you guys enjoy, and it makes every video better than the last. Click subscribe to be alerted to when we're going to do these big heatsinks, and we've got some other big SSD face-offs coming soon. If you are interested in buying the right heatsink and you're still on the cusp and you don't quite know what kind of kit you're going to need for your budget, for your needs, for double-sided SSD, for more, then do use the free advice section linked in the description, as well as a lot of my guides specifically designed around the idea of PS5 storage upgrades. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.